is how they do it. And got my own security detail in the front row. Wow, it seems like I'm right at home here this evening. Thank you for coming out, and thank you, Mount Royal, for hosting. Do we have any Mount Royal faculty, students? One, two. Mrs. Yost. Well, I very much appreciate the opportunity that I'm being given both to visit the school. I actually have never been inside this building. I've only been outside the building. Years ago, Ed Broom brought me here as the building was being completed, but we never went inside. So it's nice to kind of take a peek at the inside. And it's very nice to have an opportunity to speak on Chesterton. I'm assuming no one is here because I have any sort of reputation. You're all Chesterton fans, is this true? I hope, okay. Hopefully not too learned in Chesterton, otherwise you might be bored at some of the things I'm going to say. Although my impression of people who love Chesterton is you can repeat, as I will, some of the exact same stories almost every night, and Chestertonians just love it. Like, tell the same story again. Ms. Culbertson can probably anticipate some of the stories that I will tell tonight. G.K. Chesterton and the Romance of the Humdrum. Are we good on volume? Can I now pretend you're not there filming this? Good. All right, let's start with that last word, humdrum. This is a funny and odd word. It's a word that was coined in the Elizabethan age, as far as we can tell. Hum is older. That's a nice onomatopoetic word that usually referred to the drone of bees. And humdrum is a very typical English move of repeating the sound through a rhyme just for emphasis. So the drumming of humming is just a way of saying that the humming goes on rather long. Humdrum, as we now use it, describes ordinary things. And by ordinary, we mostly mean regretfully dull, boring things, which is why I'm here to speak. As Dominic said, I'm an expert in ordinary, dull things. And in our age, the ordinary is often thought as very dumb and very dull. The regular and the routine of our existence is ever to be avoided or to be spiced up. I recently came across a blog site, which I do not recommend to you, except for reasons of humor, affordanything.com, that opens up with the following. You want to escape the ordinary, but you also want a practical plan. You're as pragmatic as you are adventurous. You're a rebel with a retirement plan. The website then goes on to offer all sorts of platitudes about the boredom of work and the need to get away, to retire from labor, and to escape from drab, ordinary life. And articles and books bemoaning the lackluster nature of normal life are legion. The industry of self-help literature swirls around the general maxim of modern society that we're just not well, and we're not well because we have not yet been fully liberated from all the social bonds that tie us down, and we've yet to discover our true and authentic self. Now, on this point, trendsetters in our society, being at odds with everything normal, almost at war against the normal and the ordinary in our life, I don't intend to make an extensive argument or offer a lot of proofs. I think I could rest my case on the magazine racks at Target, if we could find a Target and just go look at the magazines there and flip through them. The message there is normative, normal is not good enough. Simply consider how much time and money is given over to extreme sports in the face of well-documented decline in ordinary things like playing on a baseball team or going for a hike or just going outside. If you want to have fun, you can look at the Bureau of Labor and all their data on exercise in the United States over the last 50 years. I think it's hilarious. If you look at an L.L. Bean catalog, let alone a Title IX or an REI catalog, you'd think our nation was a nation of outdoorsmen and outdoorswomen and adventurers. But statistically, barely anyone seems to be doing anything, and it's gone in a pretty consistent decline over the last 30 or 40 years. The United States is not a nation of hardy, adventurous sportsmen or really anything too hardy, although we talk a lot about extremes. Swap out sports for any aspect of work, dating, marriage, family life. Look at the extreme nature of cookbooks. I love this. I love going into cooking sections. When I got married, when I was engaged, the first wedding present that we received was the Better Homes and Garden cookbook that taught you how to make things like meatloaf and spaghetti and roast turkey. You're hard-pressed to find cookbooks like this anymore. It's all so extreme and specialized. And it's not just online. It's not just cookbooks. It's not online. It's not the media industries. It's not chiefly, I think, film or the industries of the internet. We're just constantly bombarded with advertisements and subtle messages everywhere that seduce us into thinking that the normal is dull and that edginess, transgression, pushing the limits, a little dash of thrill in the gray area, if not in the shadows, that is the only way to be authentic, free, and know you are alive and that your life is a quality life. I have little doubt that humankind has always struggled with some degree of boredom or at least restlessness. I'm not a Pollyanna on that. But that said, I'm very hard-pressed in looking through scripture or classical literature to find true examples of boredom, although there seems to be something like what we mean by boredom that begins to sort of mushroom in the literature of the late Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire at its height, I should say. But classical weariness with wealth is not really analogous to our obsession with the need for extremes and transgressions, or our loathing of the slow, the routine, and the normal. The expression to be a bore, let's take that expression, don't be a bore, to be a bore, that only dates in our language to the 18th century. The earliest example of the word boredom, does anyone know the earliest example of the word boredom? Yes. It appears first in Dickens' novel Bleak House, never used before then. So 1852 is the appearance of boredom as a word and a concept. Previously, since the 9th century, to bore meant to slowly and carefully drill, or to persist in some determined action. Hardly the negative comment that we have today. The ancients did have an idea, which they called acedia, or sloth, as it's sometimes called today. Acedia was the unwillingness to persist in one's vocation, to constantly seek distractions. In a sense, the very opposite of boring. Over time, sloth has, in the English language, come to mean slow and lazy, but this isn't really what the concept sloth originally meant, or acedia, what that meant to the Greeks, the Romans, and the early Christians. Now, boredom, to be sure, is deadly. British researchers, because we can't believe any of this on our own senses, we need a scientist to tell us this, hopefully a large government grant, and sure enough, the British government financed a long study, a 25-year study. Granted, it was of government workers, so this may be a little skewed, but it's interesting. It's a 25-year study of civil servants. And what was noted is when a person begins consistently, not they had a one-off day, but when they begin consistently to say that they're bored, statistically, the odds of them dying that year were 40% higher than people who don't say, I'm bored. In Holland, and now a variety of, Holland led the way, Holland and a variety of other countries, medically assisted suicide, paid for by the state, has been permitted for over a decade for those who state that they're bored with life. That's a legitimate reason to have a state-funded suicide in Europe. A Christian bioethicist at Trinity International University, with the great name of Nigel Decameron, has suggested that our increasing lifespans as humans may be at the root of this problem. We're just living longer and we don't know what to do with ourselves. Spend a quarter of an hour reading up on literature on drug addiction, especially opioid addiction, a drug that focuses on intense endorphin release and the sensation of euphoria. Boredom is one of the lead causes of people taking these drugs and seeking fleeting physical pleasure from the opioids. And the Granite State, sadly, is one of the leaders, as most of you know, in opioid addiction. According to the most recent data from the Center for Disease Control, New Hampshire is second only after West Virginia for the number of opioid overdose deaths. Boredom is at the heart of our broken society, it seems. Now, all of you came here on this dreary night not to hear dreary statistics, but you want to hear about Chesterton. So let's turn to Chesterton and see if he has anything interesting to say about boredom and ordinary things. And I'll start, of all places, with his book on Chaucer, where Chesterton expresses surprise that no psychologist has yet written a book called A Defense of Bores. He contends they have not because the bore needs no defense. Why? Chesterton says, the bore is joyous and triumphant. The bore is the true conqueror of the earth. In fact, Chesterton says the bore has a healthy and vigorous mind. Now, what on earth does he mean? Well, it's hard to say. Sometimes Chesterton, often Chesterton, has throwaway lines, and you have to hunt around a lot to find similar lines. But he did actually go on to write an essay called In Defense of Bores. Opening up that essay, Chesterton remarked that the universal opinion in these days is that the unpardonable sin is to be a bore, unquote. But Chesterton praises again the man who is called a bore, and he shows pity for those who are bored by the bore. Boredom, as Chesterton sees it, is a kind of decline in vitality. It is deadly. Its poison, however, comes not from the person or the thing that the bored person sees as boring. The bore, in fact, holds a secret that the bored man has lost. The bore, as Chesterton puts it, is terribly excited about things like how a lever works or what his neighbors are up to. He has a magical charm in his possession. And that charm accounts for why, despite all the propaganda against him, he, the bore, is called by Chesterton as wild. But everyone else is described as subdued. Chesterton then goes from the principle of levers or concern with neighbors to other things the bore is interested in. And the first thing he hits upon is mathematics. Then he moves to just about any academic subject. Chesterton points out it's perfectly natural for someone to grow tired of mathematics or any subject, just as it's perfectly natural that you might get lost on horseback. But the fault of someone who gets lost on horseback is not the horse's fault, and neither is the fault of someone who's bored of a subject the fault of that subject. The fault is in the person who's expressing, I'm bored. Or consider what he means by this strange positive defense of the boring. This comes from Chesterton's book, Orthodoxy. A child kicks his legs rhythmically through excess, not the absence of life. Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, do it again. Perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, do it again to the sun, and every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but he never got tired of making them. And it may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy. For we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. The repetition in nature may not be a mere recurrence. It may be a theatrical encore. I love that last sentence, right? So the kind of things that drive parents crazy often with their children, persistent, repetitive action questions. Chesterton associates with God and nature, and then he says the repetition in nature may not be a mere recurrence, it may be a theatrical encore. Chesterton brings us back to that Old English notion of bore, persistent, recurring, purposeful action, and he adds to it joy. While our society, in our restless quest to escape the routine, writes books like The Joy of, you can fill in whatever blank you want there are many joys of books, Chesterton would have us write instead The Joy of Boring Things. But here, I suppose, I have gotten a little ahead of myself. After all, some of you might not know who G.K. Chesterton is. So we'll have a little review of Chesterton's life along with mandatory vignettes about Chesterton. Gilbert Keith Chesterton lived from 1874 to 1936, making him a contemporary of Teddy Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Beatrice Potter, Groucho Marx, Albert Einstein, Gandhi, Babe Ruth, Charlie Chaplin, and just about anyone else who lived on either side of the beginning of the 20th century. He was born in the pontificate, think about this for a moment. He was born in the pontificate of Pius IX. He matured under Leo XIII and St. Pius X, and he died during the pontificate of Pius XI. But he was not a Catholic for the vast majority of those years. He was born in Kensington, England, which is near London. His parents were educated and well off. In religion, they were scarcely observant Unitarians. As a young man, Chesterton was very interested in what might be called New Age thought. He went off to the Slade School of Art, and he set his sights on becoming an avant-garde wit, a cutting-edge writer, and an artist. He moved in the most fashionable circles, the world of Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells. He took up journalism to make money, and he lived large in Edwardian England. And then he met a woman with a very romantic English name, Frances Blogg. I love that name, Frances Blogg. I wish I had pictures to show you, Chesterton Frances. Frances is quite pretty. Frances had been raised as an independent thinker, but after flirting with occultism herself, Frances took up her Anglican faith seriously, and if not Gilbert Chesterton's guiding star, he was certainly his pilgrim partner. Over time, the two of them began to practice Anglicanism faithfully, although Chesterton always thought the history of Anglicanism revealed it to be rather lightweight compared to Catholicism. Sorry, Mike. As I was writing that today, I thought you might be here, and I thought, what of the Anglican patrimony? Frances was resistant to Chesterton's impulses with respect to faith for a while, but in 1922, Gilbert entered the church, and 4 years later, on the Feast of All Saints, Frances followed him. Chesterton never cut off his old friends, who were puzzled at his Anglicanism, which was the religion of the majority of his life, and they were positively scandalized by his reception into the Catholic Church. Gilbert and Frances were both writers. People are now beginning to discover Frances's writing. It's really quite good, especially some of her plays. They were never able to have children, and much of their lives were marked with considerable human suffering, including the suicides of immediate family and friends, and for Gilbert, the loss of his brother Cecil, who was his closest friend, and many others equally dear to him in the First World War. Between 1900 and his death in 1936, Chesterton published nearly 120 books and thousands upon thousands of essays, while also speaking regularly throughout the British Isles and twice in the United States in 1921 and 1930. Like St. Thomas, Chesterton wrote by dictation, and he would often write more than one work at the same time. His works are in every genre: poetry, novels, history, theology, philosophy, politics and economics, literary criticism. He's perhaps best known for his murder mysteries, the Father Brown series, as well as his controversial work and political action with his friend Hilaire Belloc. Now, two stories are, I think, mandatory in an introductory talk on Chesterton, and because they're good and it would be a sign of our piety to remember these stories, I shall tell them. And I do think they capture the spirit of the man. There's one story of Chesterton leaving to go give a lecture. Francis, who typically managed much of the practical affairs in his life, and certainly for the household, was entertaining household guests the entire weekend, and she could not accompany Gilbert, as she usually did. She told him very explicitly at the beginning of the day where he was lecturing, where he needed to go, and then sent him on his way. Now, various versions appear of what happened next, but they more or less all agree. He seems to have taken a minor train to a local station, and then he bought a ticket for Glasgow. Just before, so he's down in the south of England, so he's bought a ticket to go up to Scotland. And just before entering the train carriage, he met up with a friend who said, "Where are you off to?" And Chesterton said, "Glasgow, Free Trade Hall, to give a lecture." And his friend said, "That's not possible because I know for a fact they're doing renovations on Free Trade Hall, and there are painters there now. It's closed for several more months." Chesterton then quietly returned to the ticket booth, and he asked where he was, and asked if he could send a telegram. The telegram was sent to his wife, and it read, "Am at Market Harborough. Where ought I to be?" To which Francis, and this part of the story is often left out, to which Francis sent a telegraph reply, "Home." It just brought him home. He didn't give the lecture that day. So Chesterton was humble, and he knew his limits. Although another fabled story revolves around his less than limited girth. He was a big man, if you've ever seen photos of him. And once during the First World War, he was on the street, and a woman came up to him in anger because she didn't like his columns, and she said to him, "Why, Mr. Chesterton, are you not at the front?" To which he replied, "Madam, if you come around to the side, you will see I am at the front." Chesterton practically spoke in delightful maxims all the time. It just shows up in his writings, and lovers of Chesterton often compete seeing how many of them they can recall. So here are a few that I give to you as appetizers of Chesterton's wit and encouragement to go read him. The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. The Bible tells us to love our neighbors and also to love our enemies, probably because they are generally the same people. The riddles of God are more satisfying than the solutions of man. Marriage is a duel to the death, which no man of honor should decline. All science, even the divine science, is a sublime detective story. Only it is not set to detect why a man is dead, but the darker secret of why he is alive. I'm trained as a historian, so I like this one from his short history of England. The past is not what it was. The act of defending any of the cardinal virtues has today all the exhilaration of a vice. When you break the big laws, you do not get freedom. You do not even get anarchy. You get the small laws. The reformer is always right about what is wrong, but he is generally wrong about what is right. And finally, this is my family's favorite. We think we should just sort of stencil this on the side of our minivan. An inconvenience is only an adventure wrongly considered. An adventure is an inconvenience rightly considered. These, of course, are all delightful, I think, and the humor of them rival the Marx Brothers, even exceed the Marx Brothers. But the cherubic delight of Chesterton, the angelic kindness of Chesterton, often so dazzles his readers that they miss the angelic clarity of Chesterton. Chesterton was something of a prophet in his writing and his thought. I should take away something of. He was a prophet. Long, long before even Catholic writers began to seriously explain how widespread birth control, euthanasia, and divorce would eventually become, how devastating these would be socially, Chesterton decried them publicly, and he suffered for it. He did so in Heretics in 1905, What's Wrong with the World in 1910, Divorce and Democracy in 1916, The Superstition of Divorce in 1920, Social Reform and Birth Control, 1927, and Eugenics and Other Evils, 1927. These are just a few of the books in which Chesterton concentrates on what would now be described as the assault against the institution of the family and normative human sexuality. These books, it should be noted, were almost entirely penned before Chesterton entered the Catholic Church. And I believe his meditation on family life and on sexuality and the Church's norms thereupon was part of the way God encouraged him to enter the Church. At the heart of Chesterton's defense of the traditional family was Chesterton's sense of perennial truths and norms. All norms in the modern world seemed under assault. As part of the rhetorical logic of modernity, which had displaced the transcendent as man's proper end with liberty and progress. If the goal is freedom, without there being any prescribed reason for that freedom, it is logical, though an untruth, that men and women must be perpetually emancipated from any constraint to their personal desire. This is a disaster for any normal form of living, marriage, social behavior, or true education. The ordinary common things of common men and women were now the subject of constant scrutiny and suspicion. Chesterton put it succinctly in his essay, The Common Man. Quote, "The thesis is this, that modern emancipation has really been a new persecution of the common man. If it has anticipated anybody, it has, in a rather special and narrow way, emancipated the uncommon man. It has given an eccentric sort of liberty to some of the hobbies of the wealthy, and occasionally to some of the more humane lunacies of the cultured. The only thing forbidden is common sense." Now, it should be noted in that remark, Chesterton is using hobbies of the wealthy and human lunacies of the cultured as euphemisms for birth control, forced sterilization, divorce, radical animal rights, self-righteous vegetarianism, pornography, and abortion. Those are the things he goes on to say. That is what is being used to assault the common man. Once the idea of progress as an ill-defined goal is elevated, and liberation without any clear moral restraint becomes a civil right, then the end is inevitable, Chesterton contended over 100 years ago. Progress will merely mean the persecution of whatever is common and normative. Proponents of this kind of progress masterfully appropriate a rather chic look, a culture of health and youth, and they tar tradition, religion, and old ways as the enemy. Yet nothing can ape religion, advance false traditions, and grasp at the throat with the same kind of spirit of conformity as skillful progressives. As Chesterton put it, progress has its hagiology, its martyrology, a mass of miraculous legends of its own, like any other religion, and they are mostly false and belonging to a false religion. The most famous is the fancy that the young and progressive person is always martyred by the old and the ordinary person. But it is false. It is the old person and the ordinary person who is always the martyr. It is the old and the ordinary person who has been despoiled of his old and ordinary rights. There is no normal thing that cannot now be taken away from the normal man. End of quote. End of quotation. The driving force of this insanity, according to Chesterton, is the rejection of the common, the normative, and the natural. Those very words are denied to have meaning. Who's to say what a normal family is, or a normal gender, or a normal course of life? Those concepts are not allowed. We see how that's borne fruit today. In the Granite State, we overturned the legal expression of normative human sexuality in 1975. We overturned the normative conception of marriage progressively between 2010 and 2019. And our laws currently allow any individual or any couple considered by the state as, quote, stable, to conceive of, in any manner they see fit, or adopt a child as they please. I believe the question will soon be asked, and regularly asked, are religious families stable? Right? So being a parent requires proof of stability. So there's been a backdoor creation of laws which were originally over cases on whether homosexual couples could have children. Could they adopt children? Could they use in vitro fertilization to have children? But the way the law is written, it grants to the state power to decide what a stable family is. It's a little bit like the foolish laws regarding homeschooling in our state, which conservatives rejoice in and think are a victory. And luckily, liberals seem to be busy with other things or too stupid to read the own law. Because the law on homeschooling grants to the state the ability to educate children and says explicitly the state extends to parents and schools the education of children. That's to say, private schools have no right intrinsically, parents have no right recognized by the state of New Hampshire to educate their children. The laws now assume there is no real norm in these areas. So-called anti-bullying and anti-discrimination laws now almost universally make it illegal in a public setting to counsel or suggest counseling on what a decade ago would have been viewed as deeply disturbing sexual and gender confusion. We have, as Chesterton foresaw and predicted, rejected the normal. And that rejection is related to the constant discussion of feelings and fears of being bored or not valued, then and now. The feeling of, to use a French word, because when you have something bad, it deserves a French word, the feeling of ennui. Ennui, said Chesterton, is the great sin. It is, quote, the sin by which the whole universe tends continually to be undervalued and to vanish from the imagination, end of quotation. Ordinary things in reality dissolve as the primacy of the liberated individual comes to the fore. And by primacy of the individual, we can only mean, in our modern world, an unformed, unguided, uninfluenced individual, or at least unformed, unguided, uninfluenced by any traditional norm. We can only mean an individual who is constantly thrown away from a common humanity, a common history, and even from nature and the world, thrown deeper and deeper into his own mind and his virtual playgrounds. I think we can recognize all the world that Chesterton foresaw a century ago as manifest. So what would Chesterton have us do? What did Chesterton himself do? He launched a crusade to defend the ordinary in all aspects. In fact, I would go so far as to say that G.K. Chesterton in the lay life is parallel to the little flower in the religious life. Chesterton shows his readers time and again that the path to wonders and happiness and grace is in the small, ordinary things of life. He does this by training us to stand on our head, to turn the canvas upside down, a very common technique in art school, to try to see something, try to paint it upside down or to look at it upside down. Chesterton does this all the time, actually. That is, he teaches and sometimes tricks us into looking at the world in reverse or through a distortion in order to consider it properly, because we probably have it all wrong. What we are told is noble, good, and free are not. We need to see and speak of ordinary, common things again as the noble. Chesterton put it this way in an essay on divorce, Questions on Divorce, where he is speaking to old friends who are advancing a vision of the transgressive life as the life for special people, educated people, liberated people. Chesterton says, if you say that marriage is for the common people, but divorce is for free and noble spirits, all the weak and selfish people will dash for divorce, while the few free and noble spirits you wish to help will very probably, because they are free and noble, go on wrestling with marriage. For it is one of the marks of real dignity of character not to wish to separate oneself from the honor and tragedy of a whole tribe. All men are ordinary men. The extraordinary men are those who know it. End of quotation. Chesterton simultaneously exposes the error of the progressive ideologue and restores the true nature of the heroic. The heroic lies in the defense of the ordinary. Now consider the principles here in this essay. The principle at stake, as Chesterton sees it, is the ordinary. And in the ordinary, our very humanity. And that humanity can only be defended by the humble. As Chesterton says, it is the small soul that is sure it is an exception. The large soul is only too proud to be the rule. To advertise for exceptional people is to collect all the sulks and sick fancies and futile ambitions of the earth. The good artist is he who can be understood. It is the bad artist who is always, quote, misunderstood. In short, the great man is a man. It is always the 10th-rate man who is the superman. And here he's thinking of the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, not the comic book hero. Now, I've shifted to some of the heavier parts of Chesterton to give you a map to understand his work, to see where he's going and why. Chesterton's normal route in defending the normal is to ramble all over little ordinary things. Cheese, odd things that are in your pocket, little china figurines and bric-a-brac, all sorts of lurid adventure books that boys like and that are all over the floor of the second floor of my house right now. Bawdy old ballads, street lamps, taking a nap, beer, slang, patriotism. These are the usual subjects of his defense of ordinary things. He also defends forgotten things which should be common, though startling, things like skeletons or Christmas. But most of all, Chesterton's defense of the ordinary, of the humdrum, swirls around what is most vulnerable in his view, and that is marriage and the family. So I'd like to move to the conclusion of my paper by turning to the opening of one of his novels, Man Alive. One word, Man Alive, 1912. The subject of Man Alive is wonderfully ordinary. On the surface, it appears intensely dull. It is the story about bored urban people living in a drab boarding house, which is where bored people live, most of whom seem to be stuck in conventional, ordinary occupations and difficulties and are grumpy, sad, and depressed about it. It's a great novel. Now, discussing novels is always difficult. In fact, I hate it when people give papers on novels, because they usually go over the whole plot and reveal all these things about it. What's the point of reading a novel? I hate spoiling novels, so I'm not going to. I'm not going to read the entire novel or summarize the novel. I'm only going to read the opening paragraph and provide you, through that paragraph, with enough to navigate the text on your own or with your family and friends. Here we go. A wind sprang high in the west, like a wave of unreasonable happiness, and tore eastward across England, trailing with it the frosty scent of forests and the cold intoxication of the sea. In a million holes and corners, it refreshed a man like a flagon and astonished him like a blow. In the inmost chambers of intricate and embowered houses, it woke like a domestic explosion, littering the floors with some professor's papers till they seemed as precious as fugitive, or blowing out the candle by which a boy read Treasure Island and wrapping him in roaring dark. But everywhere it bore drama into undramatic lives and carried the trump of crisis across the world. Many a harassed mother in a mean backyard looked at 5 dwarfish shirts on the clothesline as at some small sick tragedy. It was as if she had hanged her 5 children. The wind came, and they were all full and kicking, as if 5 fat imps had sprung into them. And far down in her oppressed subconscious, she half remembered those coarse comedies of her father's, when the elves still dwelt in the homes of men. Many an unnoticed girl in a dank walled garden had tossed herself into a hammock with the same intolerant gesture with which she might have tossed herself into the Thames. And that wind rent the waving wall of woods and lifted the hammock like a balloon, and showed her shapes of quaint clouds far beyond, and pictures of bright villages far below, as if she rode heaven in a ferry boat. Many a dusty cleric or cleric plodding a telescopic road of poplars thought for the 100th time that they were like the plumes of a hearse, when this invisible energy caught and swung and clashed them around his head like a wreath or a salutation of seraphic wings. There was in it something more inspired and authoritative even than the old wind of the proverb, for this was the good wind that blows nobody harm. End of quotation. First, note what Chesterton is doing with his words and this story. The ordinary is made extraordinary by the magic of his language. Secondly, because what is he talking about there? He's talking about bored people. He's talking about a surly teenage girl that's thrown herself into a hammock. He's talking about a boy who probably doesn't want to do his homework and is upstairs in the flickering light trying to fall into an adventure. He's using language to make that all incredibly graphic and vibrant. Second, reconsider those characters from that paragraph. They're not the characters of the novel. Those people never show up again. They're only in the first paragraph. But they're the types that Chesterton uses to draw his reader in. And I suggest they're the types of people that might be reading the book, and they're certainly the types that need its wisdom. A boy staring at a flickering image, a harried mother, an unnoticed girl, a detached teacher, a dreary office worker, the functionary priest. Consider those types. How incredibly prophetic. The wind wakes up the world of the novel and the readers and is like, as he says, like a domestic explosion. What a great juxtaposition. There you have it all. A domestic explosion. And in case the reader says, this is too much, it's just too thick, it's over the top, Chesterton, a few paragraphs later, because this kind of descriptive language goes on, Chesterton answers, nor is such a poetic fancy inappropriate, for there was something oddly romantic about this inrush of air and light after a long, leaden and unlifting day. Grass and garden trees seemed glittering with something at once good and unnatural, like the fire from fairyland. It seemed like a strange sunrise at the wrong end of the day. Unquote. Ordinary things glitter with fire from fairyland for those who have eyes to see. Now, the main thrust of this novel, Man Alive, is right before us. Perhaps I didn't even need to read you a paragraph. You can't even get past the title without hitting the conclusion. Man alive, man alive. What a miracle man is. And the miracle of man alive takes place amidst absolutely ordinary things, which are all acting upon the characters and the reader as God's spies, setting us up, getting us ready for the hardest mission that any person can accept. What mission? Threefold mission. To refuse death while staying alive, to accept the greatest romance that one can risk, to go home, and to consider Chesterton's blueprint for a good social order. It can be summarized as the willingness to break conventions in order to keep perfectly the commandments. Man alive. Did Chesterton have in mind St. Irenaeus in giving the book this title? I wonder. Perhaps you know St. Irenaeus' comment, "The glory of God is man fully alive. The life of man is the vision of God." The man fully alive, for Irenaeus and for us, of course, is Christ, the everlasting man of Chesterton. He who is the supreme paradox of human and divine, fully united and revealing the highest truths. Argumentation, political action, legal defense funds, centers for the restoration of Christian culture, elections, all these things are part of the way we defend good things. But there is a tendency, I think, when we get closer to power, to think of ourselves as beyond the ordinary and to forget the very defined and limited purposes of things like power and law and money. The glory of the ordinary, lived rightly and seen rightly, is worth a gallant crusade. The glory of the ordinary is worth even more than a crusade. It's worth our living it out with full hearts and minds. This is the lesson of almost every one of Chesterton's works explicitly. The humdrum is a kind of drum. It's a good old drum that beats the steady beat of life. We can dance to that beat and celebrate the strange human happiness that is, in fact, accessible to all through the ordinary. We would do well to spend an ordinary hour or two now and again with the angelic mind of Chesterton, who turns things upside down so that we can see them right side up. And seeing rightly, he allows us to give thanks for the glorious ordinary things of the world, which have been given to us as a gift. Thank you. I was promised pizza, but I don't see any. I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure what the format is here, but when we have these talks down at the center, as long as people stay and Dominic doesn't throw us out, the speaker usually tries to stand his ground. I'm going to turn my blind eye to this contingent since they have easy access to me for a moment. Maybe not. No questions? All convinced, all committed Chestertonians. Yes, Mr. Yost.
So you talk about the heroism of the ordinary. What would Chesterton have thought? I haven't read nothing about the sort of more ancient classical idea of the hero.
Yeah, that's interesting because he doesn't, I was thinking about this. Belloc, his close friend, was, I think, more attuned to the classical world and the goods of the classical world. So if you look at the Ballad of the White Horse, there is the character Mark the Roman there. Chesterton has a kind of respect for the Roman order. But most of his heroes are medieval or medieval revivalists like Adam West and Napoleon of Notting Hill. And I think the reason for that is Chesterton sees in Christian culture a shift around the virtue of magnanimity. So whereas classical culture had magnanimity, there were certain problems with it. And the basic problem was pride, and the magnanimous man, it was difficult in the classical world for the magnanimous man not to collide with other magnanimous men. Magnanimity was realizing that you're made for greatness. Chesterton sees, I think, exactly what St. Thomas gives us in his discussion of magnanimity, and that is kind of purification of magnanimity by way of the virtue of humility. Almost, up front, it seems like a paradox. How can you be great-souled and do magnificent things and have crusades and adventures without there being pride? Now, Chesterton's not naive to the possibility of pride, the likelihood of pride, but he sees in Christian culture a different approach to greatness, that greatness is that the Christian heroes are people like King St. Louis, who washes the feet of lepers. There's always before the Christian hero the archetype for him who washes the feet of his friends and disciples. Right? Humility is built into the vision of the heroic. And therefore, in Christian culture, the ordinary things are always going to be defended. It's almost a logical consequence of any meditation on the incarnation. I don't think he would have rejected the classical notion of greatness, but clearly his writings don't show that much interest in it compared to what happens when that's transformed and carried over into Christian culture. So since you get everything that there is in the classical world, why not focus on the Christian world, which preserves that but corrects it?
Following up on that, that's interesting to me because I've been reading something right along those lines, and I'm not very familiar with either. But is there a particular passage or book in Chesterton or in Thomas where that's addressed, that kind of baptizing of magnanimity, humility?
Thomas has a whole question where he treats magnanimity. Mm-hmm. I don't remember where exactly that is. Google it, or any index of the Summa. It's in the Summa, but I can't remember which question it is.
Okay.
There's now this you could Google, and it's I rarely recommend secondary scholarship over reading the primary sources, but I highly recommend this. It's an article that was written maybe 15 or as many as 20 years ago in Logos, which is a journal published by the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. And the article is written by Michael Keating, and it is on magnanimity. And he specifically is looking at what happens to magnanimity in Christian culture, and he spends most of his time on St. Thomas. It is
Keating,
go ahead.
O-N or I-N-G?
Keating is I-N-G, so Keating, K-E-A-T-I-N-G, I think is how he spells it. Michael Keating. Mrs. Yost.
I'm wondering if our sense of what the ordinary actually is has become diminished, if we even know, in modern times, if we know less about what is ordinary, what ordinary things are.
I'm not entirely sure the answer either. Certainly, when I spend a lot of time, I teach at Thomas More College. We read great literature from all ages. I'm trained in the classical and Christian period. And one thing that I'm recurring, that strikes me again and again, is how introspective we are. It just doesn't seem to be as evident in the ancients. You might have an extraordinarily rare person, like St. Augustine, who's straddling the ancient world and the Christian world, who you could interpret as being introspective in the way we are. But of course, his conversation's not with himself. Right? It's not Montaigne. His conversation's with God. But regardless of your political disposition or your religious tradition. It seems to me that a common condition of just being a modern is to always have to justify everything you're doing or wonder why we do this. We're so broken away from traditions. So I do think it's a particular burden of modernity. That said, I think what Chesterton, reading Chesterton, what Chesterton can help us with is how close we are to those normal things. We just need to let go of our obsessions and anxieties as best we can and think about what is common, what is proximate to us. When Chesterton writes these essays, his extraordinary vision is extraordinary, but he's not seeing a world that's any different than us. Right? Chesterton has these marvelous essays where he literally will write about what he found, as if it was a discovery, what he found in his pocket. Or an essay on a little stub of chalk. Right? His essay on cheese, which persuaded me to stop eating cheese with crackers and do an experiment to see if Chesterton was right. Does cheese taste better with bread? Is cracker kind of a modern monstrosity? And I notice there are crackers and cheese over there. And I'm sad that I don't think Dan, is there any bread? So we can't do a little experiment because, again, as moderns, we need to have experiments scientifically, usually with government funding, so that we can rest assured everything's okay. But what Chesterton points out, it's not some complicated, hard thing. It's more of a slowing down and just looking. What's your favorite teacup? Do you ever notice that you use the same things all the time? Do you ever notice that you put your things on the bedstand in the same way? Why don't you get rid of those shoes that are quite old? Right? It's a meditation on what's dear to you. Just pushing aside, justifying it to someone else. Of course, it helps if you can break free of the principal modes of propaganda in the modern world. So the degree to which you're engaged in social media, the internet, reading pop magazines, watching TV, it will simply be harder because you're allowing yourself, I don't know, depends on how much time, chart how much time you spend with these things. However many hours you spend on the internet or watching TV or reading a popular magazine, that you're giving yourself over to the propaganda of anxiety, of transgression, of extreme. Extreme is good. You need to be liberated. For the most part, that's just omnipresent. You can say, I'm not going to look at CNN. I'm only going to look at Fox. Really? I mean, I look at Fox. I look at CNN and Fox. At 3 o'clock, I look at both of them to try to get a sense of the news. But what struck me as the supposed conservative Fox is how salacious half the news is. It's just terrible. Right? What we're constantly shown. I have a news feed. I have a cell phone somewhere. And I take a perverse delight in looking at my news feed. I don't know who loaded these things up on my news feed. But here, I should get a government study for this. People magazine on the news feed, it's almost always about cannibalism or some terrible sexual transgression or how you can't trust teachers. It's about 4 storylines that People magazine uses. Now, People magazine has never been exactly a high watermark of Western civilization, but it is something that is very popular and people expose themselves to all the time. You have to break the channels by which propaganda that makes us unhappy enters into our lives. And often that is more than half the battle. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that something is lost by that lack of exposure to others?
No, because I think if you don't have those, if you're not sort of looking at these kind of ordinary, conventional sources of news, watching Fox.
Or not engaging with people who are different from you?
Well, I don't think you're engaging with people who are different from you by looking at your news feed. I think you're just becoming routine and boring, and you're not engaging anyone. You're just staring at a flickering screen. So it depends on what you replace it with. I'm not recommending going into a silo, but I don't find that people who spend a lot of time on the internet are actually tolerant, nice. They tend to think of themselves as tolerant and nice, but they're usually not. I made a decision several years ago to stop listening to National Public Radio. I had listened to National Public Radio every day in the car, going in and out of work, and I justified it by needing to be aware of what all sorts of Americans of different political views held, needing to be adept at talking to people, etc. I stopped reading it, stopped listening to it, and instead I just read books. When I came back to listening to National Public Radio, I thought I was in communist China. I was startled by the degree of conformity and just pure propaganda. It wasn't what it allegedly was, sort of teaching us to be tolerant and civic-minded. Right? Instead, I read books. I teach a course on the Eastern religions. I think I learn more about other people by reading the Dhammapada than listening to the kind of ridiculous progressive ideas that are just cranked out everywhere, that are destructive. They're destructive of human community. They're destructive of conversation. They're destructive of precisely the things that it seems to me that you need to have a human encounter and an engagement with people who aren't exactly like you. So I think it's just the opposite. I know we get hung up on issues of socialization and we shouldn't disengage. And I'm not arguing for total disengagement. But I do think most people are far too anxious about constantly checking these things, and it leads to unhappiness. I just don't think I can be challenged on this. Very few things where I just think, come on, take me on. But I think everyone who owns a cell phone, no one has, I say this all the time, no one says, no, that's not wrong, that's wrong, you're wrong. I don't know a single person who has a cell phone who doesn't suffer from anxiety from that cell phone. That's to say, I've never met a person who owns a cell phone and they're not throughout the day wondering if they should check the phone. Or, let me run you through this one. I'm sure most of you who have had a cell phone have forgotten your cell phone. Now, I'm 52 years old. I didn't get a cell phone until, I know exactly when I got a cell phone. When I became the president of Thomas More College, I was required to own a cell phone. It was the first cell phone I had, so 10 years ago. People who forget their cell phone seem to become basket cases. But I spent 42 years of my life without a cell phone. I went to the grocery store without a cell phone. I didn't worry about, what if I'm at the grocery store and I get in a car accident? How will I tell anyone? Or what if I see my wife's cell phone and she's gone to the grocery store? Oh my gosh. What if she's in an accident? And my poor wife is just riddled with anxiety over cell phones. I don't think these technologies which we're taught help us be connected to one another deliver. They seem to do the opposite unless you approach them with a great deal of intentionality. And I think, as with most things in life, you can only approach something with intentionality by detoxifying first and then coming back. So you're free from any habits that the thing or the practice may be exerting on you, and you can make a decision for yourself. Every Lent, I give up alcohol, apart from feast days, because I'm too weak to give up alcohol entirely. And it's a great blessing, because by the first Friday, right, Ash Wednesday, I feel awesome on Ash Wednesday and Thursday. I'm giving up beer. I'm so hardy. I'm like the desert monks. And by Friday, I'm looking at the calendar, wondering if St. Othold the Bald is a sufficient feast day for me to have a beer. I'm very weak, so I depend on that purification with something that is a good beer to have a proper relationship with beer. My guess is that with things that can be wonderful and interesting and useful, and I'm not just saying that, internet, cell phones, they can be very useful. But if we don't periodically abstain from them, as with any other human thing, they begin to cloud our judgment and destroy goods. Mm-hmm.
How, in standing for ordinary things, how can we avoid giving the impression or appearance of hostility towards
Well, you're just charitable. See, I think, I mean, this seems to always be a concern of good people who are wondering, but if I'm true to my principles, will I hurt the feelings, or will I come across as belligerent to someone whose behavior doesn't agree with me? And that almost always boils down to homosexuals, and now that's kind of expanding into trans people. Being a good Catholic has nothing to do with kind of bullying or saying you have to conform to my views. That would be to behave exactly like them. I actually haven't met gentle, sweet homosexual people for years. I lived 3 years of my life in Atlanta, and my mother worked at a university, and there are a variety of homosexuals. Atlanta is a very big homosexual city. Homosexuality in the 80s and 90s was very different than it is today. It's become militant. There's no interest in coexistence, despite the bumper stickers. It's calling upon for not merely tolerate and accept, but kind of submit to, there are no norms, and you affirm my lifestyle. It would be wrong if you simply reversed that and said, oh, you're completely disordered. Let me tell you how disordered you are. That's, to me, that is not Christian in any way, or properly understood conservative. People who do not share our values are interesting, in my point of view. I want to know why they don't. I'm interested in people. One of the reasons I was drawn to study Eastern religions is I wanted to know why such a huge part of the planet hasn't just folded into Christianity. What makes them tick? What are the goods in their society? I'm just curious, as a human. It actually helps me see the vulnerabilities and weaknesses and hypocrisy of my own faith when I study these. And I would think that a good person who's concerned about not hurting or tyrannizing someone who is not like them, and that from a principled, reasonable position you believe is actually suffering mentally, that the last thing you would do is conduct yourself in any way to push them aside or push them away. Christians are called to engage them, and grace builds on nature. Part of that engagement has to be through seeking things that are in common, showing respect, and not immediately moving towards what you might see with absolute clarity as a terrible wound, terrible sin, terrible defect in their behavior. Now, if you're a parent, you're trying to protect your children, there are other times where you might have to be brusque, and you might have to hurt their feelings. That's okay. Hurting people's feelings is not a mortal sin. But it's just human decency to try to find a path towards friendship and conversation, not gravitate towards a shooting match. So, I think if you're inclined to avoid harm, you're going to avoid harm. Now look over here now. Thomas More, people, questions? You're all thinking, gotta get. Yes, all right, Mr. Hardy.
What would you say the relationship is between spirituality and presbytery?
Well, I see them. I'm not a master of the Little Flower. Chesterton, by the way, was one of the first people in the English-speaking world that pushed the Little Flower. I think he was. I'm almost positive he was still Anglican. I think he wrote the introduction to one of the first translations of her writings. And I think what's similar is both are bringing us back to something that is the thing that is at the core of our faith. God actually manifests himself in the ordinary because he himself chose to be ordinary. In the sense of, he didn't pick a member of the ruling elite. He didn't pick a great classical hero to be his father. He didn't incarnate himself in the center of Rome. He picked an out-of-the-way, rather ordinary place. The incarnation, I think, and the life of our Lord is what both of them are reflecting on. And there may be other contingent things in the age that draw their attention to the ordinary. But I find in both of their writings, they are both focused on the simplicity of grace and goodness, even though their style is very different. And almost the opposite of what it should be. You'd think a French woman would be the one with the flamboyant style, but it's not. She is, at least in translation, what seems to me simple, spare, Carmelite, I suppose, rhetoric. Whereas Chesterton is exuberant. But when you get behind what the rhetoric is delivering, it seems a similar truth, and it's sort of getting us to slow down and look at that which is simple and understand that simple actions, simple things may in fact be the most direct path to sanctity and happiness. In that respect, I think they're similar. No more complicated than that. Paul.
This may be more of a reflection, but I like how you bring up the extremes. We're going to extremes. And I think almost everybody would agree, left and right, political discourse, the extremes are coming out all over the place. It seems like, I'm just curious what you think about this, so much when you look at social media, you look at the internet, you look at music, so much of it is assertion of a position. I am right because of this. I am right because of that. Oh, you're wrong because you did this. I condemn you because you said this. I blah, blah, blah. You don't see a lot of questions being asked.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious if there's something about that having to have to appreciate the ordinary or be surprised by the ordinary. You need something of a disposition of openness. You need a disposition of really willing to question. I'm just curious what you think about
Yeah, I like everything you said, and I wonder a lot now about what's changed in America. I don't really like either political party. I consider myself conservative, but I don't really like either political party. My political memory goes back to Ronald Reagan. Of course, people have, in the history of the United States, shouted at one another, bullied and been mean, but I don't remember it. I don't remember it like it is now. And I wonder, what are the causes for that? And then how they relate to ordinary things. Everything is so extreme. I don't, with respect to political discourse, I do think that part of what's going on can be observed in the way we receive information about the civic life. So most people get their foundation, in a way, as they have for a long time, through public schools. Vast majority of Americans are educated in public schools. Vast majority of Catholic schools dance to the beat of the public school drum. The standards are skewed, etc. But after that, and so you can talk about their problems there, but after that, most Americans are no longer reading a newspaper at a breakfast table, talking to their family, maybe passing around sections of the paper, going into the office, did you read this? Most people are reading different blogs, news sites. People can set up, and news junkies I know do this, you set up your page that allows you to just be in a silo so that you increasingly get your side's information. So it's becoming more of a propaganda network than common national discourse on civic life. I mean, when Reagan was president and I was a little boy, there were 3 television stations. There was no internet, and most towns had maybe 2 newspapers. Now we have hundreds of news sources, we have bloggers everywhere. And what seems to dominate the tone is what I think is one of the great evils of public life today, and that is the comm box. I think the commentary box on news sites is evil because it purports to be about conversation, purports to be about the writer will engage the readers and he'll even answer questions, and then we can have this community all over the country, all over the world of people reading an article, getting into the commentary box. I've yet to see this commentary box that's described. Usually it's foul-mouthed people ripping on other people or on the author and then disappearing, or people cheerleading for the author's side and then mocking people they don't like. That seems to have tainted the way people discuss things on television and in life. It's so strident. It's just taking a side. There's no common deliberation, common source of information that you can talk about writers and views of writers at a newspaper. It's simply, I grew up in a conservative family. My father every Sunday got the New York Times. We all know now that's a loser has-been paper for flaming liberals. No conservative could read the New York Times. Well, I grew up in a conservative family. We had the New York Times every Sunday. We all had the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Lewiston Sun, wherever we lived. We had the local paper and a couple national papers. That's gone now. Everyone is just in their camp, and the technology allows that. And that leads to a bad tribalism.
Yeah, I was just thinking, we're so quick to show so much disdain. Mm-hmm. It seems like that attitude is just corrupting of ordinary things. Yeah, this doesn't matter. That
No.
doesn't matter.
People don't allow themselves to do ordinary things or think about ordinary things. And when you read the newspaper, you thought about the news 20 or 30 years ago, then you went to the PTA or a baseball game where you had to deal with other people. You played sports with people. People don't do communal things where you're naturally brought together in a common pursuit with people who might have other interests that don't line up with you. It just doesn't happen nearly to the degree it used to. And as a result, we're habituated to think about our side and the other side as the enemy because they don't share our values. But a lot of these values are now dictated by social media groups. Right, left, center, it doesn't matter. The technology seems to close down the fundamental humans together in conversation in a specific place. That's the foundation of overcoming this stuff, but that never happens.
So you talk about a little bit about tradition, and as Chesterton goes on, the Christmas traditions and everything. Being in America, I find it kind of hard to look at the traditions of our culture because we don't have many, or at least I can't find many, but there's something that I definitely want to live out. Would you say some of the best ways are to bring back that
Yeah, tradition's hard. Once you've lost a tradition, how do you, without being precious and posh, bring back a tradition? Right? How do you naturally bring back a tradition? I think you just have to have a generation of people who say, this used to be the tradition. This is going to feel kind of forced. But if we do this for a period of time and it has obvious good results, the next generation won't feel like this is alien and it'll be restored. It only takes a generation to restore these things. I didn't grow up with a Jesse tree. I'm trying to go through Christmas traditions. I didn't grow up with a letter on December 6th from St. Nicholas. I didn't grow up with a family that talked at home about the liturgical year. Had that in church or at school, but not from the lips of my own parents. So all those things, which, in certain Catholic communities, they weren't shared universally, were natural. For me, as a young parent, were very unusual. And having to establish the traditions, I'm in this, the issue that Mrs. Yost brought up. I'm in the state of constantly thinking about what I'm doing. When you're thinking about what you're doing in that manner, i.e. when you're trying to establish something that may become a tradition, it's not a tradition. Tradition is something that you're not really thinking, should we do this? How do we do this? You might be thinking about how's it going to look this year, but you just execute on it. So the restoration of things through tradition, the restoration of the ordinary, requires a kind of courage and imagination of a generation that's determined to bring certain things back. So it is, I fully admit, it is a modern or postmodern form of traditionalism, because you're discovering traditions largely through reading, media, conversations with people who aren't your community, and you're trying to introduce them, place them in your community, but, who cares? Who cares? I mean, it's the devil's tool to get us to think about, am I being fake, not fully authentic, hypocritical? Right? It's like the poor person in Mass thinking, I'm not sure that I'm worthy enough to receive communion. Well, you're not. Get over it. You're not worthy. Go to confession and receive communion and stop obsessing about things in your head. I think we do that with, how do I reestablish the ordinary? What's Chesterton talking about? Again, talking about having cheese and drinking beer. That is that, and then we're postmodern, so we can pull aside and we can say, "Hey, we had beer. We're reestablishing tradition." Fine, we can't escape that. We should do that. It's not for us. Tradition is not for us. It's for a large continuum of people. So you just have to put aside yourself with restoring these things. Yeah. Yes. I think I will be happy to continue a little bit, but we do have to wind down, so some people can politely leave, and you can experience some delicious cheese and crackers. So, thank you.